Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. This is the Planning Advisory Committee for Tuesday, February the 14th for the Municipality of the County of Kings. I'm calling the meeting to order. We have all of our complement with us today, with the exception of Councillor Windsor, who is out on a medical leave. So he will not be joining us today. We have an agenda before us. Are there any amendments to the agenda from any of the members? No? Can I have an approval of the agenda, please? Councillor Allen? Ms. Friars, thank you. And we're using the voting, Lorianne? Okay, thank you. So all those in favor, you can register your vote now, please. Great, that's unanimous. So at this point in the agenda, with it approved, we look for disclosures of conflict of interest. And I have two hands up. Councillor Allen?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a conflict of interest with 8C.
8C, okay, thank you. And Mr. Morris?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a conflict with item 8B.
Thank you. Appreciate that, letting us know. All right then. So we also have before us today the minutes of the January 10th, 2023 meeting. And if there are no errors or omissions on your read-through, I'll entertain a motion to approve. Councillor Granger, Ms. Gagnon. Feels like forever since I've been in this chair. All those in favor, please register your vote now. Great. Was there any business arising from those minutes from any of the members? Nope. So we'll move on to the business of the day then. Our first item today is the Municipal Planning Strategy Amendment for the Greenwood Growth Centre. And we have with us Mr. Ian Watson, a Senior Planner for Upland Planning and Design Studio, to fill us in on all of that. So your mic is on, Mr. Watson. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, members of PAC. My name is Ian Watson, Senior Planner at Upland, and this is a proposal for Municipal Planning Strategy and Land Use Bylaw amendments for the Growth Centre of Greenwood boundary. You've seen this before, but I'll refresh your memory on it if you'll recall. The proposal involves kind of two subject sites. The primary subject site, former military housing site known as Clements Park. That's in yellow on the screen. It's composed of a number of PIDs. And then in looking at this application, staff recognize an opportunity to kind of bring comprehensive planning to the whole area, so identified a secondary subject site in purple on the screen that composes two schools as well as a municipal lift station, and those are all currently zoned institutional, which I have on my next slide. So Clements Park itself is currently unzoned. The current municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw identify it as federal lands and therefore did not apply any local planning to it. The site is currently vacant. And the proposal here, initiated by the municipality, is to prepare the site for housing development in preparation for if the federal government identifies the property as surplus and divests it. So to do that, we'd want to have some sort of planning framework on these lands. So the proposal is to bring the lands within the growth center of Greenwood boundary, and then in this case designated as residential on the future land use map, and place the comprehensive neighborhood development R5 zone on the zoning map of the land use bylaw. So there you can see there's the former, or the current boundary in red of the growth center, and then if this proposal is to be is successful, the boundary would then follow that black line. And this is the proposed zoning, R5, covering the whole primary and secondary subject site. So you did, before the holidays, back in November, as a Planning Advisory Committee, host a public participation meeting on this proposal, November 29th to be specific. And if I recall, approximately 3 members of the public attended that meeting, and one of them got up to speak, representing the village of Greenwood. And to paraphrase, the gist of the speaker's points were that the village understands that full development of the land is some time away. You know, it's going to depend on the federal divestiture program, and you know, there's a review that's needed to identify if there's federal needs for those lands, and there's a whole process that has to go through before anything happens. But the speaker believed that the proposal at the municipality here is an important first step to any future plans for the site. So in terms of process, you've had your public participation meeting. We're back here at PAC for a potential recommendation from you to council, at which point council will be in a position to give the amendments first reading and hold a public hearing. As you'll recall, last time we met, we did go through some of the policy review of this proposal and its compliance with both the greater municipal planning strategy and with the statements of provincial interest. And so in light of that, and in light of the comments from the public participation meeting, we recommend that you forward a positive recommendation to council. And there's a very wordy motion for you to do so.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the members for Mr. Watson? Go ahead, Ms. Gagnon.
Thanks. I couldn't get it to apologize, Madam
I know
Chair.
it seems to be slow today.
Okay. So I have a few questions. Regarding the rezoning for the schools from institutional to R5, how would that affect in the long-term processes for the schools to either grow as the neighborhood would grow? So, you know, imagine the neighborhood grows, more kids, the schools want to grow, become bigger or change or put in generators, that kind of stuff. Like, how would changing the zoning affect the schools and their operations? Also, I have no idea if schools pay taxes, but if they do, does it involve a change for them and any kind of burden economically or tax for them to be changed into a different zoning?
Yeah, thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. So I guess the easy one first is the taxation, is that municipal planning zoning categories don't affect taxation. It's how the land is used, and then in that case also with provincial properties, they tend to pay grants in lieu of taxes and that kind of thing. For the use itself, correct me if I'm wrong, Laura, but it would become non-conforming in the R5 as a use, or does that allow institutional?
I was just thinking, I didn't even realize you had turned my light off. That's a very good question. I believe they would be non-conforming if we applied R5 zoning, but as they're provincially owned, they're not actually required to meet our bylaw. They can opt out. So if they were expanding or doing something that would trigger something under our bylaw, they have every opportunity to opt out of that. So yes and no. Yes, they would be non-conforming. No, it's not a huge impact.
And I'll add to that too, I guess, that the land use bylaw does have provisions for expansion of non-conforming uses, even if they were to go that route.
That too is correct,
Yeah.
yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to clarify from a development officer perspective, they would not be considered non-conforming under the MGA. They are exempt, and that's the end of it. So non-conforming would not come into play unless or until they approached us for new use within that was not owned and operated by a provincial entity.
Okay, so this rezoning wouldn't negatively affect the schools is what I'm getting from from this conversation. Okay. The second thing is, I was just wondering with the R5 zoning, a lot of the land that is vacant actually has a lot of forest, and a lot of people use it for walking. It's I guess there's a lot of dog walkers, just neighborhood. The subdivision across from there uses it. ATVs actually go on it, even though they're not supposed to, but they do. With an R5 zoning, would these considerations be taken into account in the process of the development agreements? I believe have to be by development agreements for the R5 zoning. So would all these current uses by the population be considered in the process?
Through you, Madam Chair. So yes, that's correct. That the R5 zone comprehensive neighborhood development requires development to go through a development agreement. The idea it being comprehensive, and a big piece of that for this site was thinking about the fact that there's going to need to be new, there are services in the ground, but who knows what kind of condition they're in. Same with roads and that kind of thing. So having that comprehensive look. Through that process, certainly that could be something that council considers in the broad picture of looking at a development agreement. There's not any specific policy in regard to this site about, you shall maintain the trails that exist or whatever, but there is that opportunity to at least have that discussion as part of the negotiation process that staff and council would go through with any potential developer.
Okay, thank you. I think that's about it. I just noticed on the sidewalk map that for Tremont Mountain Road, there is a sidewalk. It's not indicated on the map, but I think it's because it is on the federal land. So there is a sidewalk there.
Okay.
Just for your information. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? No. So the motion we have before us is the Planning Advisory Committee recommends that Municipal Council give first reading to and hold a public hearing regarding proposed amendments to the municipal planning strategy and the land use bylaw to include PIDs 555-12149, 555-07297, 555-07313, 553-08928, and 555-07305 in the growth center of Greenwood boundary. Redesignate the lands as residential on the future land use map, and rezone to comprehensive neighborhood development, R5 zone on the zoning map, and to rezone PIDs 554-90163, 554-90171, 554-89330, and 555-12131 to comprehensive neighborhood development, R5 zone on the zoning map, which will permit comprehensive residential development as described in Appendix B through G of the report dated October 11, 2022. Can I have a mover, please? Councillor Killam, thank you. Councillor Allen, thank you. Is there any discussion? All those in favor, you can register your vote now. And that's unanimous. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Watson. I hope your drive home is better than your drive down.
Be here tonight too.
The next item we have before us is an application to rezone a portion of the property on Highway 201 in Greenwood. That file belongs to Mr. Fredericks. And your light is on.
Thanks very much and good afternoon. We do have a planning application here to consider a rezoning of a portion of a property in Greenwood, just on the other side of Greenwood than we were just talking about here. And I would recognize that the applicant, Mary d'Entremont, is in the audience with us today. Mary and Brian Morris have applied to rezone the subject property from the residential 1 and 2 unit or R2 zone to the residential mixed density R3 zone. And this proposed R3 zone would permit the development of grouped dwellings on an otherwise vacant property. Some background here, the applicant purchased this property in early 2022. It's heavily forested, vacant land, and it is within the growth center. It's about 27 acres in size, and it has road access from Highway 201, as well as a potential connection from Spinney Street and Dakota Lane. So its location on Highway 201 is considered a collector road, and it has a variety of services in the area, including central water and sewer, King's Transit, and a variety of commercial and mixed residential uses in this neighborhood of Greenwood. There was a large wetland identified on this property in the back portion, and that area was removed from the potential rezoning, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So this zoning map shows the approximate kind of rezoning area. The full property is shown in red. It's a fairly large property, and it's the front front 2/3, let's say, that's being considered for rezoning to the R3 zone. And again, that would permit the development of grouped dwellings. Certainly this area is home to a variety of 1 and 2 unit dwellings along Glasgow Avenue and Dakota Lane. But it's in an area of mixed use. Certainly the Greenwood Mall brings a fairly large concentration of commercial development and a variety of other commercial uses along Central Avenue. And then within the kind of broader area, there are other R3 and R4 zoned properties, as well as R5. So it's a very mixed area, but it would be largely an extension of this community behind the Greenwood Mall and be developed under the R3 zone. So as part of the planning process, we sent letters and held a public information meeting. We heard from a few people within that kind of notification area because there were a number of those properties notified. And there were some general concerns. There wasn't really any opposition to the proposed development. No one was opposing that. But we did hear some general concerns like extending sidewalk infrastructure, developing some parkland spaces that the municipality owns within this area, and other servicing extension kind of questions from some of the folks along Highway 201. The planning strategy does allow council to consider rezoning applications from one zone to another zone enabled within the same designation. And in this case, we've got an R2 zone property that's within the residential designation, and the request is to go to the R3 zone. And both of those zones are enabled within the residential designation. And so we've got an R2 zone property. This policy would allow council to consider the rezoning request to move it to the R3 zone. As part of all of our rezoning process applications, we also consider the zone placement policies. And this is outlined in more detail in the report, but certainly the R3 zone is intended to apply to areas where we have a major transportation corridor or a major road, and Highway 201 is designated as a collector road in the planning strategy. So it's consistent with the zone placement policies, or the R3 zone placement policies. And the impact of both the specific proposed development and any other possible uses permitted within the R3 zone are all considered to be fairly consistent with the kind of residential neighborhood in this area. In fact, the density of development is perhaps higher, but the land requirements in terms of square footage is very similar to the R2 zone. And so it's a very similar impact. Both the R2 zone and the R3 zone are really centered around residential development. And the general criteria we'll look at on the next slide here. The general criteria, these apply to every planning application. We look to see that the proposed rezoning or proposed development agreement, in this case it's a rezoning, but we look to see that it's in keeping with the intent of the planning strategy. And in this case, certainly we're directing residential growth within our designated growth centers, and that's certainly consistent with the intent. The feasibility of services is quite plausible here. There are potential connections on Spinney Street. Land use compatibility we just spoke about. It's a residential area, and certainly the R3 zone would be compatible with the surrounding residential neighborhood. We look at impact on well fields, and in this case, the subject property is outside of the Greenwood well field. But even if it were within it, the proposed residential uses are not a prohibited use within that well field. So no real impact there. And we look at site suitability as well, and this was an interesting issue. It's a fairly large property, and it does contain a wetland, and that wetland was identified through a wetland delineation process that the applicant engaged, and so certainly a portion of this site may not be suitable for residential development, although the potential is there for wetlands to be altered to make it more suitable. But in this case, we've just avoided that wetland portion altogether. So there is a large wetland in the back of the property, but the rezoning process here only applies to the sort of front portion, which does not include that major wetland. And that's what this looks like here. So again, the subject property is this kind of large rectangle or trapezoid shape, but we're only talking about this front portion, and because there's a large wetland in the back here. And we're seeking to avoid that. The applicant was willing to avoid that area as part of the R3 zone development. So in terms of the process, we did hold a public information meeting. We heard some concerns about the public infrastructure within this portion of Greenwood, but no real opposition to the proposed R3 zone. And we're looking for a recommendation from the Planning Advisory Committee today towards Council, who would give it first reading at their next monthly meeting. And it would be then moved to a public hearing. So staff are confident that by avoiding the wetland, that the R3 zone seems appropriate for at least for the front portion of this property, and it generally meets the general criteria as well as the specific rezoning criteria applicable in the planning strategy. So with that, I would pass it back to the chair and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Ms. Gagnon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. In regards to the wetlands, how much of a buffer zone have you given yourself where you delineated it and separated it, but how much of a buffer zone is it? Because we've seen in other regions like Halifax Regional Municipality where they've had wetlands and did not develop immediately next to it, but did eventually develop all around, and the wetlands eventually dried up. So I know we look at drainage a bit and how the construction happens, but in the long term, how much of a distance, how much of a buffer are we giving to that wetland, considering it could dry up, in a few years once the rest of the land is developed potentially?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the boundary that we've drawn here considers that and adds what's generally applied within our municipality as a bit of a buffer. I mean, we've kind of rounded out that shape. We've taken a delineated wetland and kind of drawn it back a bit. That varies from corner to corner, but it's in the area of 10 or 20 feet here and there. It may be more, maybe less in some spots, but essentially what we've done is rounded that boundary out and given to try to give ourselves a bit of that buffer. But the exact number of feet varies from sort of corner to corner.
Okay, and then from this point on, we have our process, but at some point does the environmental department of the province step into this application or in the construction in regards to this wetland, or to ensure that buffer is enough? Or
through you, Madam Chair, certainly Nova Scotia Environment and Climate Change, that department would be consulted at a point where a wetland alteration application was made, which is a possibility. But again, if the development is avoiding the wetland, then they wouldn't be directly consulted initially. But again, if there was any alterations proposed to the wetland, then they certainly become part of the approval authority in that case.
okay, and do we ever rezone an area that once we've identified it as a wetland and know it's there, do we ever rezone or reconsider the zoning for that area? Because now that portion that is not included for the R3 remains R2. So should it be rezoned ecological sensitive in the process of rezoning the other portion of the land, or separately on a separate occasion? But do we ever do that?
Through you, Madam Chair, it hasn't been our practice to do that. It was considered in this case, but we ultimately ended up with this kind of zone boundary line. There isn't a clear process in our planning strategy that outlines the opportunity to apply O1 or environmental constraints zoning to a newly identified wetland. And that's the trick in this, I think, is that ultimately it's sort of a provincial jurisdiction, and landowners, and the onus really lies on the landowner to recognize and avoid these areas. You know, what we have in our O1 zone certainly generally covers a lot of wetlands, but not always, and certainly not always newly identified ones. So, you know, we certainly considered that, and currently we don't really have policy support to apply O1 zone to an applicant's property in this case, because, I mean, the downside, of course, is that it limits development significantly and would prohibit any sort of permanent structures. On the flip side of that, the Nova Scotia the province, you know, would still enable the ability for a landowner to fill in a portion or all, or at least a portion of a wetland, and then have a compensation type program where they create new wetland areas in another location. So because that opportunity exists, staff felt like it wasn't appropriate to limit development potential on the back portion, but just stick with the R3 portion in the front.
Okay, thank you. And on a separate question regarding sidewalks, with this development adding R3 and the intensity of that mixed density, would that facilitate Greenwood eventually being able to get sidewalks all the way to that area? Because currently there isn't sidewalk all the way to that area, I believe.
That's right, and certainly that would be our hope. That's what we'd like to see. I can see Trish has her light on there. I'll let her answer, but in general, you know, that'll sort of follow the development pattern. So if it gets built out, so if it gets built out, then obviously it'll become more of a priority to provide more services further down that road. Go ahead.
Really, Mark covered it off quite nicely, but just as a reminder, sidewalks would be a village responsibility, so that would be a trigger for the village to take that into consideration.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any other questions? No? Okay, the recommendation that we have before us is that the Planning Advisory Committee recommends that Municipal Council give first reading to and hold a public hearing regarding the application to rezone a portion of PID 55120059 from the residential 1 and 2 unit R2 zone to the residential mixed density R3 zone as described in Appendix D of the report dated February 14, 2023. Do you have a mover? Ms. Friars, thank you. Ms. Gagnon, thank you. Is there any discussion? No? So if you'd like to register your votes now then, please. Oh, okay, yeah, gotcha. I was trying to figure what that extra box was. Yes, it is unanimous amongst the ones at the table. Thank you. You're welcome to come back, Mr. Morris. Our next item is an application to amend the text of the land use bylaw in the historic hamlet of Grand Pré, Zone A5, and that is Ms. Ullman's file.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to recognize that the applicant is in the audience. So this is an application for a land use bylaw text amendment for farm supportive uses within the historic hamlet of Grand Pré A5 zone. The property that triggered this application is 11611 Highway 1 in Grand Pré. So Jason Lynch, on behalf of Grand Pré Wines, has submitted an application to amend the text to allow farm supportive uses within the historic hamlet of Grand Pré. Farm supportive use means the use of a lot or buildings on that lot for uses such as, but not limited to, agricultural warehousing, processing, sorting, grading, packaging, offices, and transport facilities located on the farm property and associated with a farming business. So just for clarification, this text amendment would only be relevant to properties defined by the Income Tax Act as a farm. So adding farm-supported uses to the list of permitted uses will allow farms and agricultural businesses to expand production, process, and storage, and add economically to the local community while retaining the rural character of the area. An increase in production could also lead to the demand and need for more employees, adding employment opportunities to the historic hamlet of Grand Pre. So this is the approximate location of the property that triggered this application. And this is the historic hamlet of Grand Pre, A5 zone. So the text amendment would include the entire zone, but as I stated previously, only farms would be impacted. And all the land bordering the current A5 zone is agriculture, and this use is already permitted in this zone. So this is the property that triggered the application. It's located on Highway 1 and Grand Pre Road. The zoning map shows that it is within the historic hamlet of Grand Pre zone and surrounded by agricultural zoning. And then it is within the historic hamlet of Grand Pre. Can I just clarify something? Is this, I thought for the designation that this is all agriculture. Oh, okay. So it is within the agricultural designation. So for the policy review, the enabling policies, 5.3.2, council shall amend the text of the land use bylaw, provided the proposal meets the general criteria for amending the land use bylaw, set out in section 5.3, development agreements and amending the land use bylaw. So the policy review, 5.3.7, the proposal is consistent with the municipal planning strategy and Grand Pre and Area's secondary plan. There would be no costs to the municipality. There are no land use conflicts because the proposal is consistent with retaining the rural character of the area. In terms of traffic, the proposal will eliminate current conflict with winery visitors, including internal, pedestrian, and commercial trucks using the same access. And for clarity, drainage issues are outside the scope of consideration for this application, since the amendment would apply beyond the property that triggered this application. So in terms of the general criteria, it does fit within the general criteria. The municipal planning strategy, 5.3.5, consider in relation to all applications to rezone land that A, the applicable zone placement policies, including any specific policy criteria for applying the proposed zones set out within this strategy. The subject property is within the agricultural designation, and farm supportive use is a supporting use to agriculture. The proposed text amendment is consistent with the zone intent and placement policies because the zone not only permits but promotes agricultural uses, and farm supportive uses are an accessory use to this use. For the Grand Pre secondary plan, 4.6.1, council shall consider the policies contained in section 4.6, the Grand Pre and area plan, when considering municipal planning strategy and land use bylaw amendments or any other initiative that may impact the Grand Pre and area plan boundary. So the vision statement for the historic hamlet of Grand Pre indicates a priority for sustaining a healthy rural setting by conserving the culture, environment, and agricultural landscape. The purpose of this zone is to retain the historic character of the Heritage Conservation District of Grand Pre. And the lands located in this zone are intended to contribute to the maintenance of existing residential areas within the historic hamlet of Grand Pre, while allowing for residential care facilities, not-for-profit camps, small-scale fixed-roof overnight accommodation, with or without a public restaurant component. In terms of agriculture within the Grand Pre plan, to recognize the significant role of agriculture and of the Grand Pre marsh body in preserving agricultural lands in the area, to reduce land use conflicts by controlling and limiting land uses and establishing requirements for agricultural land in the area, to encourage the agricultural industry and appropriate related business. Council shall recognize the importance of existing agricultural policies in preserving agricultural land for agricultural use while reducing the potential for land use conflict by establishing controls on non-farm uses and provide more stringent lot requirements within the agricultural designation in Grand Pré area to preserve a density consistent with the rural character of the area. The goal to foster and sustain a business community that complements the rural setting and meets the needs of visitors and local communities. The secondary plan states that council shall encourage commercial development that is small scale and promotes a pedestrian-friendly environment. So with the Grand Pré Heritage Conservation District, for clarification for this, property owners had the opportunity to opt into the Heritage Conservation District. So not all properties within the historic hamlet of Grand Pré are designated as heritage properties. So on this map, only the areas that are shaded in gray are properties where owners opted in to the Heritage Conservation District plan. So right now we are at PAC. So a municipal planner conducted a site visit on November 9th and met with the applicant to discuss the proposal, and no concerns were raised. 15 letters were sent via letter mail to properties within 500 feet. A public information meeting was held in municipal chambers December 7th, and there were 8 people in attendance, and 4 of these people asked questions. The biggest concern raised by residents were the water issues along Grand Pré Road, which is out of the scope of this planning application. 2 calls were received asking about clarification about farm supportive uses and discussing the water issues. And 2 residents sent emails about the application with regards to the Heritage Conservation District. Staff have reviewed the request for a text amendment to the land use bylaw against the vision, goals, objectives, and policies of the municipal planning strategy, and have determined that the proposed amendment is consistent with the policy of the municipal planning strategy. A farm supportive use is an agricultural use and should have been permitted as of right when the historic hamlet of Grand Pré A5 zone was created. As a result, staff are making a positive recommendation to the Planning Advisory Committee. Staff are recommending that the Planning Advisory Committee forward a positive recommendation by passing the following motion.
Thank you. Are there any questions or clarification for Ms. Ullman? I think Councillor Granger's trying to turn.
With you or against
There you go.
or something.
It's all yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just wondering what this word, the verbiage means. For clarity, drainage issues are outside the scope of consideration for this application since the amendment would apply beyond the subject property. So I'm not quite sure what that means.
I believe because generally when we do a land use bylaw, it's property specific, but this is applying to an entire zone. So we're not looking at the drainage in this case because it is for the entire zone.
Gotcha. Okay. And I also wanted to ask, I don't know if there was mention about the size of the processing buildings. Do we know that yet, or that's in the works? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify through you, Madam Chair, to Councillor Granger. So because this is a text amendment, right? So as Katie said, the zone applies to multiple properties. So all of those specifics would be dealt with at the time of permitting.
Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Gagnon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, I guess along the same line as Councillor Granger, by permitting this wording in the A5 zoning, does that mean that they can build new buildings for storage that would otherwise have not been there in the A5 zoning? Like new buildings that were not there can be built now that they have that zoning, that the wording is in there, or it would just mean existing buildings that are already there?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you to Ms. Gagnon. Yeah, it enables a new use, so that use can occur in new buildings or existing buildings, but it does need to be associated with a farm. So there is that little
Caveat.
caveat, yeah.
Yes, okay, so it has to be a farm-related operation, agriculture, can be a new building, and so the standards for those new buildings. So I guess where I'm concerned a bit is just, I don't know how far this particular site, but the whole A5 zone with the Grand Pré historic site, the actual church and everything, and the landscape that you see when you go to the Acadian historic site. And from what I can tell from the maps that we've been shown, it seems to be close. So I'm wondering if permitting this usage in that A5 zone permits buildings that would be a certain height or size that would detract from seeing the historical land use, seeing the historical site of Grand Pré, or change the touristic attraction of the area. So that's why I'm wondering about how buildings are affected by this formulation in the A5 zone.
Sure, through you, Madam Chair, to Ms. Gagnon. So within the A5 zone, we do permit agriculture. So that would permit buildings like barns. So they already are permitted.
Okay.
So, and the other thing to consider is that the Grand Pré historical site is near the northern end of this area, and this zone is primarily south of all of that. So any sort of views that are there now would reasonably be maintained because they're just on the other side.
Okay, so substantially a farm that's closer to the Grand Pré historic site and would want to put in a storage facility or a packaging facility, they'd be far enough from the Grand Pré site in the A5 zone, or they'd be close enough that they can build a building there anyways?
I think what I'm trying to say is that the impact would be similar as what could happen today.
Now. Okay, so it doesn't change that impact. Okay,
right.
Thank you very much.
Come on. Ms. Friars.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question around application in other areas within the county, and I'm just wondering if the change in this wording would be applied or could be applied in other scenarios across the county. And I'm just looking for order of magnitude here.
I'll attempt to answer that one through you, Madam Chair. What is unique about this situation and this text amendment is that this particular zone, the A5 zone, exists in one place and one place only within the municipality, and that is here in Grand Pré. If that was the question in terms of impact.
Just to cover off as well, this use is already permitted within our agricultural zone and our rural mixed use zone, so the majority of agricultural lands are already able to develop this type of use. It's really, I mean, it's in the name, farm supportive use, so it's a use that supports agriculture. So if, you know, where Grand Pré is an agricultural community, it stands to reason that we want to support that industry, and we want to enable them to have uses that are supportive to that industry.
Thank you. Any further questions? The motion before us is that the Planning Advisory Committee recommends that Municipal Council give first reading to and hold a public hearing regarding amending Section 8.7.2.1 of the Land Use Bylaw, permitted uses within the historical hamlet of Grand Pré, A5 zone, by adding farm supportive use to the permitted uses list as shown on Appendix A of the report dated February 14, 2023. Can I have a mover, please? Mr. Morris? Councillor Granger, thank you. Is there any discussion? call the question. You can register your vote now. And that is unanimous by the members at the table. Thank you. And Ms. Ullman's going to stay with us for the next one. And that is an application to enter into a development agreement at 7096 Highway 1 in Coldbrook.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is at 7096 Highway 1 in Coldbrook, and it is a development agreement to permit building and contractors' use as well as manufacturing use on this parcel. So Cody Holland has submitted an application for a development agreement to permit the construction of tiny homes which are considered recreational vehicles. This is the approximate location of the subject property. And this is the subject property. There's 125 feet of road frontage along Highway 1. The property is 2.73 acres. I'll show you in a few slides, I'll show you a more recent photo of this site because it doesn't really look like this. So the site photos that I have don't really match this photo. But right now there are mature trees and vegetation along the property line. And this property is surrounded by a mixture of commercial uses. We have Callister's Country Kitchen, which is a restaurant, a computer store. The subject property operates a landscaping business. There's a thrift store, auto sales, and winemaking. So as you can see, the subject property is zoned mixed commercial residential. There is general commercial and there is some general commercial to the east, and then residential mixed density to the east and to the south of this property. Building and construction uses and manufacturing are both permitted within the adjoining C1 zone, but a development agreement was chosen for the best course of action because of the surrounding residential lands to the rear of the property and the fact that they are zoned R3. So this way we could mitigate any potential future land use conflicts if that land is developed. So the subject property is within the commercial designation, and building and construction uses and manufacturing are both permitted within multiple zones within this commercial designation. So this is a site plan of the proposed development agreement. So right now, there is an existing dwelling which the applicant resides in and a garage. There's vegetation now in the center of the property, and he is proposing a 5,000 square foot workshop, but only 2,500 feet he's proposing to be his space for manufacturing these tiny homes. So the lot lines on this aren't exact, but this is a representation of what the site looks like now. So the applicant has cleared a lot of the dense trees out of the site. This is a photo of what the building would look like. So approximately half of this building, up to half of this building would be allowed for the manufacturing use. And then this is a photo, Highway 1 is right here. This is the front of the property. And this is what the site looks like. So this would be towards the back of the property, the approximate location of where that building would go. And then this is looking east. So for the policy review, enabling policies, the subject property is within the commercial designation, and it is staff's opinion that the purpose of the mixed commercial residential zone outlined in the previous section of this report can be maintained by permitting the building and construction contractor and manufacturing uses. The adjacent property, as I stated before, is zoned commercial, general commercial, and right now these uses are permitted on that subject or on that adjacent property. The use of a development agreement in this instance, as I stated, will mitigate any potential land use conflicts in the future, and staff are of the opinion that a development agreement is preferable, since rezoning it would make the dwelling non-conforming enable manufacturing on the entire subject property. So the use is compatible with the purpose of the mixed commercial residential zone. So 3.2.9, council shall consider only by development agreement in all commercial zones proposals for commercial, industrial, mixed use, and residential developments that are not otherwise permitted and cannot meet applicable commercial zone standards. The proposal does not permit as of right manufacturing under the current zoning, but the adjacent property does. The manufacturing would be permitted within the building at the rear of the property, and this is the only area that this would be permitted in on the property. The topography and tree buffer that the applicant left will also help mediate any potential land use conflicts in the future. So for the commercial designation, the goal is to identify lands where commercial activities are promoted and prioritized over other lands. For the transportation objective, to direct commercial centers to main transportation corridors. And for economic development objectives, to promote and encourage entrepreneurship and innovation. So this property is located along Highway 1, and Mr. Holland does have, he is an entrepreneur, he does have his landscaping business, and then he's getting into the construction of tiny homes. The zone purpose of mixed commercial residential zone is to complement established commercial areas and provide the flexibility to permit both residential and lower impact commercial use, such as local retail or business offices in the same area of a growth center. So the property contains an existing dwelling, which serves as the applicant's primary residence, and an existing garage that the applicant uses for residential storage. The rear southern portion of the property, approximately 80%, was treed and has been unused, and it has now been cleared. So that area, he stores primarily his landscaping equipment, and that's where the building will go. So the applicant's proposed building is a total of 5,000 square feet, but he only intends to use half for manufacturing, and the other half will be for storage for his landscaping business. In terms of general criteria, the proposal is consistent with the intent of the municipal planning strategy and applicable goals and policies contained within. The proposal does not involve any development costs to the municipality. The Provincial Department of Public Works has no concerns with regard to road network circulation, access to or from the subject property, or traffic generation by the proposal. The Kentville Fire Chief has advised that there is adequate protection of services and central sewer is available. In terms of well fields, in Zone D of the Kentville well field, manufacturing is permitted. And with the development permit, this proposal does not create any land use conflicts. So the purpose of this development agreement is to enable uses such as manufacturing use and building contractors use, which are not permitted in this zone, and it will help control the location of these uses on the property, as well as it's going to regulate the outdoor commercial display. We're regulating it to the mixed commercial residential zone requirements, except we're asking for a 20-foot setback for this. A public information meeting was held on April 27th, 2022, and the associated presentation has been available on the municipal website since that time. 26 property owners within 500 feet of the subject property were notified of the public information meeting. 6 people were present at the public information meeting and no comments were received. 2 comments from the public were received, one for general information and one for the current upkeep of the property. So right now we're at the Planning Advisory Committee stage, and if a positive recommendation is recommended, then we will go to first reading. So staff are recommending that Planning Advisory Committee forward a positive recommendation by passing the following motion.
Thank you. Are there any questions of clarification from any of the members? I have one. If you wouldn't mind to go back to your pictures. Okay. Now, when you go back farther, there's one that you said that there was a whole bunch of trees, and those are gone now. So right there,
Yes.
there's all kinds of trees that ring that property, and then there's a big clump of them in the middle.
Yes.
But the pictures further on basically show it's been cleared of everything.
Those pictures, sorry, through you, Madam Chair, those pictures are behind that clump of trees.
Oh, okay. And there was one there that you showed, it looked like a hill had been carved out behind some houses. Yes, right here.
Yes, so the property line actually goes to the top of this embankment.
Okay.
So it looks like Mr. Holland has put some storage containers within his property.
So do you know
along the
how
bank.
far back, like what kind of feet there are between the back of that person's house and where he stuck these storage containers in?
I'm not sure. He is well within his property line, though.
I know. Neighborly, though. Okay, thank you. Ms. Gagnon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the more recent pictures, because that was one of my concerns when reading the text and seeing the pictures. One question I have is with the development agreement. I don't understand why the workshop is worded to be as far away as possible from Highway 1 and as close as possible to the residential 3 zoning. I mean, the Highway 1 is where you have the commercial 1 zoning and the commercial 3 zoning. The neighbors next to it that are commercial have basically just concrete in a building. But we recommend, or the applicant has already deforested his land to put the building as far away as possible as where it's commercial and as close as possible, bearing your buffer from residential areas. To me, it would have been more sense economically, ecologically, to be as close as possible to the highway and as close as possible to the other commercial zones, rather than as close as possible to the residential zone. So I know it says there won't be a conflict from the staff's analysis, but to me, the workshop, the place where the work and the power tools and all that's going to be, is actually going to be closer to where residential zoning is. So I foresee there could be conflict, even with that buffer zone. And as we see on the picture and the land already, don't know how much that buffer zone is going to do for diminishing possible conflict with the workshop. So I don't know why the workshop is so far from the commercial zoning and close to the residential zoning, I guess, is where I'm trying to figure out why that was decided. Is it just because the land was already all cleared and he'd already started, or why was that? Yes, please.
Through you, Madam Chair, to Ms. Gagnon, the land closest to Highway 1 is currently developed with a 2-unit dwelling. So in order to move the workshop, he would have had to remove the dwelling, which he currently lives in. So I don't think that was on the table for him.
Could he not have put the workshop closer to his dwelling rather than closer to the back?
That would have been possible, but in terms of overall impact, I can't see that making a significant difference for those residences. And the lands to the south are all vacant, so there's no compatibility issue at this time for those lands. Any residents moving in would have every opportunity to know that there was a workshop in the rear of the property to the north.
Okay. Trish has her light on. I wonder if she wants to.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe I'll encourage Katie to speak to the grade issue that the site experiences, and maybe that'll help clarify some things.
The site is almost shaped like a bowl. So along all the sides, it's very, very steep banks. So, and it is also narrower at the front of the property off Highway 1, and then it opens up as it goes towards the back. So the back of the property is actually where the majority of the flat, usable space to construct anything is.
Okay. Thank you, that helps.
I just have one more question. Could you show us the map? Probably would have been one of the first. So I'd just like to know where the houses that we saw in those pictures, where they are in relation to this particular.
So they're over to this side.
So on the west side.
Yes, and this property line here is actually sitting up on the top of that bank.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Any other questions or clarification? Nope. Oh, yes, Ms. Friars.
I guess just this has triggered a question regarding the property line being at the top of the bank. Are there measures being put in place in the development agreement to ensure that they're to prevent erosion, I guess, of the sides of that embankment? And if in terms of a buffer, is there anything that can be done to at least, probably would have been better to keep some trees there for visual purposes, but also sound abatement in the future, but mainly concerned right now about erosion and it going right back to the property line.
Through you, Madam Chair, because this development agreement is for building and construction uses and manufacturing uses, looking at the slopes was out of the scope of this, because we are focusing that within that building.
Okay.
Through you, Madam Chair, to Ms. Friars, and just to add to what Katie said, so in terms of vegetation removal and excavation, these are activities that can occur on properties without a permit. So it's not necessarily something we seek to control in development agreements, but I would just point out that the vegetative buffer is 30 feet wide around the property. It's not intended to be removed. It's written into the development agreement that this is an area of no activity and that vegetation is intended to grow naturally. So it certainly doesn't preclude removal of damaged or diseased vegetation, but it also indicates that if they were to be removed, that a 6-foot opaque fence is required. So that doesn't necessarily stop noise, but certainly does stop visual. And our preference would be for the vegetation, certainly.
So if there's nothing else, the motion before us is the Planning Advisory Committee recommends that Municipal Council gives initial consideration to and hold a public hearing regarding entering into a development agreement to permit building and construction contractors' use and manufacturing use on the property located at 7096 Highway 1, PID 551536696, Coldbrook, described in Appendix A of the report dated February 14, 2023. Have a mover? Councillor Killam? Mr. Morris, thank you. Is there any discussion? Nothing? I'll call the question. You can register your votes now, please. Thank you very much. That's unanimous. Well, we're just hot-footing it right along here this morning, or this afternoon. I'm not even sure it's morning yet. The next item on our agenda is we have a conflict for not our next, but our second next Planning Advisory Committee in April. And I think that someone has some options of dates for us that we might be able to look at. So there they are on the screen, April 5th, April 17th, April 19th, and April 20th. Do we know what?
We were suggesting 1 p.m. We were suggesting 1 p.m.
Yeah, I was just wondering what days of the week they are, because some people can identify more by the day of the week.
I did look that up. So
Wednesday, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday.
What, is that what it is?
Wednesday, Monday, Wednesday.
Okay, so, yeah, I'm open to suggestions.
Wednesdays are a conflict for me.
Okay. Wednesdays are a conflict. So that leaves out the 5th and the 19th for you?
Yes.
Okay. So we're looking at Monday the 17th or Thursday the 20th? Monday the 17th? All right, you okay with that, Kate? Okay. So Monday, April the 17th will be the scheduled day for our PAC 2023, 1 p.m. Great. There is no public, so I'm assuming they have no comments. Our next date is March 14th, 2023, 1 p.m. these chambers. And if there's nothing further than anyone wishes to bring forward, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Councillor Killen's got his hand up already. Just pick a couple, Lorianne. All those in favor? That's great, and unanimous, no surprise. I thank you all for your time.